60% of all deaths in the United States lead to cremation. How should Christians think about cremation? Is it just another burial alternative? Stick with us and we'll talk about it.
This is the Bible Sojourner, where we discuss issues related to the Bible, theology, and culture. I'm your host, Peter Gaiman, professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages at Shepherd's Theological Seminary. Shalom and welcome. Thanks for joining.
Welcome back to another episode of the Bible Sojourner. Today we're going to talk about cremation. You know, it's interesting. When I was in seminary and growing up, I didn't think too much about it. In fact, I remember after seminary at one point finding an article, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that discussed whether or not Christians should embrace cremation and whether or not they should practice it. And I remember thinking, I have never thought about this issue before. And it's somewhat complicated by the fact that Scripture doesn't speak explicitly about cremation. So I want to talk about this today and explore what the Bible has to say principally. And we're going to look at a few resources to help us with that. When I taught the pastoral ministry class at our seminary, I used to be in charge of the ministry preparation class. And one of the things that we did was we would talk about this issue. And it was very fascinating to hear the different perspectives of the students and debating one another about the pros and cons of whether or not we should allow Christians to burn the bodies of their loved ones or whether we must practice burial. You know, it's perhaps less known that America has been very slow at embracing cremation. And the first recorded cremation in the United States that I'm aware of is in 1792. There was an individual by the name of Henry Laurens, and he was the president of the Continental Congress. And partly because he was afraid of being buried alive, he actually mandated that in order for his offspring to have part of his estate, they needed to burn his body, which apparently being burned alive was less intimidating than being buried alive. I don't know. So anyway, that was the first cremation that existed in the United States, at least according to historical record that I could find. And it was a private, non-commercial cremation and very, very rare during that time. But as things progressed, in 1876, so, almost, about 80 years down the road, we had the first commercial cremation in the United States, and that was Baron Joseph Henry Louis Charles de Palm, and he was cremated in Washington, Pennsylvania. And, if you think of this progression, you have almost no record prior to that time of cremation. And in the following years, there was a slow adoption of cremation, although there was still a social resistance to it. In fact, in the 3 years following de Palm's cremation, there were only there were 4 cremations that existed during that time period. But then if you fast forward, 20 years after the fact, there were almost 2,000 cremations and there were 24 crematories in 15 states. So you began to see a commercialization of this process. And what I want to do right now is if you're watching this, I'll put something on the screen. And if you're not watching this, I'll explain what you're seeing. What I have here on the screen is I have stats on the most recent innovations of cremation, and this is put out in 2024, I believe. It gives stats through 2023. And what we see is that there has been a tremendous amount of growth and this isn't on this PDF that I'm showing here, but in 1999, the big benchmark or hallmark was that the United States reached 25% of all deaths ended in cremation. But as you can see from the chart, in 2008, that number increased to 35.7%. And then in 2013, that number reached 44.9%. And then in 2018, that number reached 52.9%. And then in 2023, just 2 years ago, we had 60.6% cremation rate of all deaths. So now it is the most common form of dealing with the body of a deceased loved one or an enemy, depending on your relationship. So those are the realities. And there is a comparison chart here with Canada. I don't want to go too much into some of the other countries, but I will make a couple notes. Canada leads the United States, as in most things. Canada tends to be, 10 years ahead of the United States in how they view things. So in 2008, Canada had a 58.9% cremation rate. 2013, they had a 63.9% rate. So already, 10 years ahead of the United States. 2018 was 71.3. And then in 2023, 75.3% of all deaths ended in cremation. And so that is, again, pretty standard, leading the United States, and the United States will catch up in about 10 years or so. And the estimates say that there will be a plateau reached at about 80%. And whether or not that's true, I guess we'll see when things progress. But it is interesting how even at the turn of the 20th century, really 20 years, but prior to that, you had the first cremation, very rare in the United States. And now, you're looking at 6 out of every 10 individuals that die end up being cremated. And I think that's a fascinating development. And I should say as well that there is if you look outside the United States and some of the Western countries, those statistics are much higher. For example, Japan has I think it's like a 99.9% cremation rate. So you can go outside the United States and Western countries and find even higher rates than that. And part of the reason for that might just be economics or logistics with the lack of space in the island of Japan. We'll talk a little bit about that coming forward. But I do think it is helpful to acknowledge that this is becoming more and more popular. And as Christians, we need to think about it. I think a lot of people just would probably assume it's fine. But I do think that there are some theological ramifications, which we need to talk about. Now, before we go too far, I want to bring back this map up of the United States, comparing 2019 and 2023. And you can see which states are the most common where cremation takes place. And you'll notice a trend, and I'll explain it to you for those of you who are listening. But the trend is that there's where secularization exists, there is more proneness to being cremated. I think that's kind of fascinating. In the 2019 chart, you have states like Texas and Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. You have Ohio, or Iowa, I should say. You have these different states, all the states in green, states in yellow that have a little less. There are a few blue as well, which would be like Tennessee, and you have Louisiana, you have Alabama, those kinds of states which have the lowest cremation rate for 2019. And in 2023, there's a lot more, and the last vestiges of 31 to 40% cremation rate, so less than half, would be these Bible Belt states, okay, like Alabama and Arkansas, things like that. So you have, it is interesting to see. But on the contrast, the ones that have 71 to 80% cremation rate would be Minnesota, Florida. Interestingly enough, California hasn't quite reached the pinnacle, and I wonder if that's partly because of the Catholic influence of some of the Hispanic population or things like that. I don't know. We could discuss why that is, but you do have quite a bit of Arizona, and you have Nevada, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, all of those places being very, very prone to if you see the color coordination there, high 81% rate of cremation. So there are some definite patterns here with regard to maybe some more secularization and cremation being embraced that way. Now, I will say, okay, so what does that mean? I think that's just important to help us know that these things are becoming popular, and we ought to do a good job of trying to think through it. And so I want to try to help us think through that with regard to what some other people have said. And one of my obvious big influences in life is John MacArthur, partly because I went to master's seminary. My family was Grace to You subscribers, all that. And And MacArthur always has a way of putting things. And I think there were, in seminary class when we talked about this, there were probably like 4 or 5 students that quoted this article. And it's on the Grace to You website. It's a response to the Q&A. And what somebody had asked MacArthur, does the Bible prohibit cremation? And what he says, there's, I think, 4 paragraphs here of an answer, but one of the paragraphs really stands out. He says, obviously, any buried body will eventually decompose, Ecclesiastes 12:7. So cremation isn't a strange or wrong practice. It merely accelerates the natural process of oxidation. And I think this is a more, this statement, cremation isn't a strange or wrong practice. It merely accelerates the natural process of oxidation. I think that's a more refined version of something I've heard him say in person before, where he just says, all bodies return to dust, and cremation is just a way of speeding that process up, returning to dust. Okay. And I think that that's how a lot of Christians think. I'm not sure that there's a standard Christian view on this, but I think that most Christians probably just haven't thought about it a lot, and they just assume, the Bible doesn't talk about cremation. And so there's not really any problems with participating in it. And listen, I don't think that I think there are different categories of sin, or like things that are, level 1 issues, level 2, level 3. And I do think that there are some things that we ought to think about in more detail, though, than just saying the Bible doesn't talk about it. So I want to go through some Bible passages that Rodney Decker covers in his article and talk about some of the things that he has discussed. So in going to this article, I'm going to upload it in the show notes. But the title of the article is it better to bury or to burn? That's the name of this article, and it's written by Rodney Decker, and I'll upload it, and then you can find it in the description. But one of the things about Rodney Decker, some of you don't know who he is, but he was just a phenomenal, godly man, great scholar. He died of cancer in 2014. And, I remember I was in seminary during the time, and I remember tracking his life, or the end of his life, just being so thankful for his example. He was blogging about, what he was going through and what he was trying to do. And then after he died, his wife did a couple conclusion blogs, and I think I saved them all because they were very impactful. And one of the things that she said is that Dr. Decker, Rodney Decker, was godly even in dying, in the sense that he did everything he could to the last breath to possibly take care of his family, making sure that he had gotten rid of all of his extra stuff just so that his family didn't have to deal with that. So I just really respect him, really appreciate the way he thinks on things. I don't think I agree with him on everything, but this article is very thought-provoking as usual for the things that he's done. He's a great Greek scholar, wrote in the Baylor Handbook, the Mark volumes 1 and 2. So just really good stuff. So he introduces cremation, and he's writing later. This is a 2006 article, I believe. And so he's writing, much earlier than what we have the 20 years of hindsight to be able to assess some of these things. But I want to talk about his arguments with regard to Scripture. And so he has these biblical references of cremation, which he starts off talking about 1 Samuel 31. So he gives a handful of mentions in Scripture that talk about the burning of bodies. All right, and I think it's helpful to at least, although there's no command or prohibition in Scripture concerning the burning of bodies, I think we can accumulate some data points which help us think through this. Whether or not you agree with me, that remains to be seen. So he says the first biblical instance of cremation is found in 1 Samuel 31, which records the cremation of Saul and his sons. And so this is 1 Samuel 31, 8 through 13. And he says, the Philistines found Saul and his 3 sons fallen at Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and fastened his body on the wall of Beit Shan. He's abbreviating the narrative here for us. When the people of Jabesh Gilead heard of what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men journeyed through the night to Beit Shan. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Beit Shan and went to Jabesh, where they buried them. Then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh. I think I actually misread that. It should be where they burned them. I think I said where they buried them, but where they burned them. And then after they had burned them, then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh. That's 1 Samuel 31, 8 through 13. And so he summarizes this basically just saying this is actually really kind of an interesting story in the sense that it's very abnormal, and his theory, which I think makes a lot of sense, is that in contrast to the normal burial process, which is absolutely true, the burial process is normal during this time period. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. In contrast to the normal burial process, Saul and his sons were burned to preserve their honor and dignity. And if you think about it, if they tried to transport these stinking, swollen, grotesque corpses throughout the land, that would just be very dishonorable and shameful. And one of the things that the author points out here is that they're commended by David for their kindness in their act. And so how is that kind to go through that process? Well, they rescued them from the dishonor of being displayed as a public shameful display, and then they were, transported as dignified as possible and brought them to be buried in the land of Israel. So one of the things that is pointed out by Decker in multiple places is that wartime does have kind of a unique, element to it where exceptions do take place periodically. And I do think that this is obviously an exceptional circumstance. Second reference that he brings up is Amos 2. And this is very fascinating. In Amos 2, we see verses 1 to 3, this condemnation of Edom, or the condemnation of Moab dealing with Edom. So it says, "This is what Yahweh says, for 3 sins of Moab, even for 4, I will not turn back my wrath, because he burned as if to lime the bones of Edom's king. I will send fire upon Moab that will consume the fortresses of Keriot. Moab will go down in great tumult amid war cries and the blast of the trumpet. I will destroy her ruler and kill all her officials with him, says Yahweh." And that's Amos 2, 1 through 3. And what Decker points out in the article is that the Moabites are being judged for burning the bones of the Edomite king. Now, people could speculate and say, well, that's just a part of their atrocities, but specifically the burning of the Edomite king, burning the bones of the Edomite king, just kind of the picture is as if to lime. So it's a intense burning. It essentially does fit the kind of idea of what cremation ultimately leads to. They are being judged by fire. So because they use fire to burn the king of Edom, so they too will have fire brought upon them to Moab. Now, obviously, I'm not going to say that in every instance, burning a body is wrong or sinful. I'm not saying that. I am saying, though, that Amos 2 is provocative in the sense that this is the sin that is brought up here, this desecration or dishonoring. And it is probably targeting here not just the killing the king and burning him or forbidding him of having burial, but possibly, at least it is a bit speculation, but it is possible that they're exhuming the king and burning him to dishonor him. So he had already been buried, and then so they're desecrating the burial, digging up the king and burning him. So that's kind of a provocative example. There's another one in Amos 6. So famous Amos has 2. And in Amos 6, you have Adonai Yahweh has sworn by himself, Yahweh Elohim. These are Decker's translations using Yahweh and Elohim. Declares, "I abhor the pride of Jacob and detest his fortresses. I will deliver up the city and everything in it. If 10 men are left in one house, they too will die. And if a relative who is to burn the bodies comes to carry them out of the house and asks anyone still hiding there, is anyone with you? And he says no, then he will say, hush, we must not mention the name Yahweh." Amos 6, 8 through 10. So this third example in Amos 6 gives us a little more insight. And again, it's a wartime scenario where there's a siege and then devastation that's brought upon Israel. They have a great military defeat, and there are just corpses all over the place. And so what do you do in a scenario like that? And this, unfortunately, has happened in history, where after you have just these mass casualty events of war or plagues or things like that, sometimes it's just not possible it's logistically, impossible to bury, so many bodies. And that's kind of the picture here, is that there's not really a way to bury all these bodies. And so you end up burning them to deal with the stench and the corpses and all of those things. And again, it's not a prescription. It's just describing in prophecy about the great and terrible onslaught that they're going to experience. Now, Decker goes on to talk about a few other examples. He talks about how divine judgment is often linked with fire. So he talks about Nadab and Abihu, which are fascinating examples. And there it's, the idea that God uses fire to judge people and burns them so that they're unable to have a burial, that seems somewhat provocative again. You also have the idea of the sons of Korah, the Korah rebellion. Achan and his family in Joshua, those are examples that are brought up where they are all burned with fire. So each of those, Nadab and Abihu, the Korah rebellion, and then Achan, who stole from Jericho, and then his family was burned, and then they had a heap of stones raised above them. It is interesting that those examples again are just very clear that there's judgment and fire related. And I think that that's, again, helpful to think through. Now, there are actually two prescriptions that are given in Scripture to deal with the burning. And in Leviticus, so in Leviticus 20:14, we read, if a man takes a woman and her mother also, it is depravity. So in other words, if somebody marries a woman and her mother, so you have this incestuous relationship going on, it is depravity. He shall be burned with fire. He and they shall be burned with fire, and there may be no depravity among you. So that's Leviticus 20:14. Very clear prescription actually for a certain kind of sin. And Leviticus 21:9 is similar as well. It says, the daughter of any priest, if she profanes herself by whoring, profanes her father. She shall be burned with fire. Okay, so another example. And if you look at those examples, what you're basically dealing with is that these are special atrocities. These are this is depravity on full display, and so we need to rid the land of this depravity. And one of the things that I think is interesting about looking at these texts, obviously, this is a bit of an assumption, but I think it's a warranted assumption as we go through. I think you might be convinced of this. You might not, and you might say you're a loser, but that's fine. That comes with the territory. I think that one of the reasons burning takes place in these cases is because individuals are considered as being present even in death if their bodies are around. And so the whole point is that this sin is just very infectious into the land, and we don't want any memory of it, and we don't want any influence of it. So let's entirely remove even the possibility of remembering it by saying these people aren't even buried here; they're burned. And I think that is similar. Well, we could talk more about this later, but I think that's similar to what's going on in Genesis. In Genesis, the end of Genesis, do you remember how Joseph tells his brothers, the Lord will remember you. He'll bring you back into the land. We're in Egypt right now, but the Lord will remember his promise. And when that happens, he tells them, he says, take my bones and bring them up to the land of Canaan. Such an odd command, but I do think that there's something going on there where there's this expectation that somebody is not just spirit. They are also physical in the sense that Joseph says, I want to be with my people in the land of Canaan, and I do think there have been some articles written on this that I think are correct, is that I do think that is a kind of a expectation of resurrection that Joseph is declaring, saying, I know that these aren't just bones. this is my future body, and I want it to be brought over to the land of Canaan. I think that is Joseph declaring faith in a future resurrection and restoration to his body. And so you think of those things, biblically speaking, fire is often associated with judgment. I think that's true. You also have the lack of burial being seen as a curse. In fact, this is worth mentioning in Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23. This is in the law, Deuteronomy 21, about burial. And he says, if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day, for a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land that the Lord your God is giving you an inheritance. So the implication there's a couple really neat observations about this. One would be that if you leave the man hanging on a tree, then that is defiling your land. That seems to be the implication of that last phrase there in verse 23 of Deuteronomy 21. And so the need for burial even belongs to the criminal, except for a few exceptional cases, which we talked about in Leviticus. But the reality is that even for these individuals who are, punished by the death penalty, they're hung on a tree, it's mandate that they be buried because it's a special kind of curse to be denied burial. And that's going to defile the land. And I remember reading Abner Chow's dissertation. He actually wrote his dissertation on this passage here. And one of the things that he mentioned in regard to the scenario in 1 Samuel, where you have the Saul being hung on the wall at Beit Shan and desecrated that way, and the need for the people to undergo true burial in order to remove the stain from the land. And I think that there are examples of that throughout Scripture. I do think 2 Samuel 21 with Saul's family there also plays into that to a certain degree. So this kind of text does give us an example of this, that to be denied burial is a curse. This is the expectation of what burial should be. So I know what you're wanting to find out right now. You want to know, okay, archaeologically, what was the common burial practice? And this is so cool to find out. It's really kind of neat to see, and it's one of my favorite parts of going to Israel, for example. When I get to go to Israel and I get to see, the different tombs and the graves that are found from different time periods, it's just super instructive. And so I want to give you, I know it's just a picture, and some of you are listening to this, you're riding your bike or whatever, and that's good. Mowing your lawns. Many of you mow your lawns to this podcast. I want to give you kind of a insight into what this looks like. Okay. And so I have a couple of pictures here that I think are helpful. The first one I want to show you is a picture of what's known as Ketef Hinnom. So Ketef Hinnom, if you're looking, this is a picture that I took. It's basically, if you're not looking, it's basically a rock slab with a little cave dug out at the very bottom of it. Okay, so it's a rock slab with a cave dug out at the bottom of it. Now, at the very right side of the photo, there's actually a place on the right side where you can see there's an indent for a head to be laid. And so some of these graves would have one, some would have a lot more depending. It was usually multi-generational, so sometimes you would have enough places for 4 or 5 people to be laid. And so you would lay them down, their head would be in the mark there, their body would be on the slab, and they would decompose there for maybe a year, maybe a little more. And then once they would decompose and their bones were left, then you would take their bones and you would throw their bones in the gathering there, where the bone pit, sometimes they call it the bone pit or the bone pile. And so that was the common practice. In fact, this particular grave, which is at a location just outside of Jerusalem at a place called Ketef Hinnom, is where they found, in a part of those bones, they found a silver amulet. And on that silver amulet, which dates to about the 8th century BC, they found a rendition of the priestly benediction in Numbers 6, which shows that people already by the 8th century 7th century, depending on how you date that, were already very, very aware of numbers, which is no surprise if you believe what Scripture says as far as dating. But for liberals, it was quite surprising to see those things. So this is what's known as a first temple tomb, meaning that these kinds of tombs were in use during the time of the first temple prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in 587-86 BC. Okay, but although that's a lot of fun to think about and see, and there's a couple of tombs like this, the one during the time of Jesus is what's known as a first century burial tomb. And so it's similar in the sense that it has a place for the body to compose on the shelf, and the body is laid there, and the body decomposes. But then when the body decomposes, you put the bones in this bone box, this ossuary, and then you put it in its little vault or little slit in the wall there. And here's an example of what a bone box would look like. It's just like a little chest, like a treasure chest, but usually made not out of wood, but out of stone or something like that. And so this type of burial is called a Second Temple burial. And again, it's not like right away they switched over, but at some point during the Second Temple period, starting with the destruction of the temple and then the rebuilding of the temple when it's completed after the return under Cyrus, at some point, this way of burying becomes prominent. This, what they call the Second Temple tomb. Okay, so this would have been the expectation for what was going to happen with Jesus when he died and was buried, is that he was going to be laid in the tomb, and then when he decomposed, jokes on them, but when he decomposed, they were going to put his bones in a bone box like that. All right, and so this would have been what was expected for the ancient Israelites during that time. And it is important to note, too, that during this time period of the Romans and the Greeks before them, cremation was definitely used. It was not just a possibility, but in many cases, it was the primary means of burial for the rich and the elite. The cremation was one of the ways that they would go out, as it were. And so even though that's true in the Greek world and then in the Roman world after them, cremation wasn't just, periodically used. It was used quite regularly. Even though that's true, as far as we know, the Jewish populace as well as then the Christian populace, although the Christians became largely Gentile, they did not practice cremation. All right. And part of that comes from this presupposition of the physical body being a part of our identity. Okay, I want to read something from Decker's article because I think it helps give us insight into kind of the expectation of what the expectation was for the biblical data and contrasting it with the culture. All right, so he says in section 3.4 of the article, when the biblical data presented above is considered, there is clarity and consistency. Although there are a variety of funerary practices attested in the ancient world, the biblical record consistently depicts burial. Cremation is virtually unknown in biblical practice, though it was a common but not universal practice in the ancient world. Both the Greeks from Homeric times and the Romans practiced cremation as the preferred means of disposing of a corpse. Okay, so that's what we just talked about. The Romans and the Greeks used cremation. So he goes on. By contrast with the Greco-Roman practice, the Egyptians practiced cremation, but in addition to burial, mummified the corpse before interment the Egyptians rejected cremation. The Egyptians rejected cremation, but in addition to burial, they mummified the corpse before internment in graves or tombs. For Egyptian royalty, this took the form of the extravagant pyramids. For the wealthy, a sealed tomb, but the common folk of Egypt received only earth burial. All, however, were apparently mummified to some extent. Outside the biblical world, cremation is the norm in Buddhism and Hinduism. The ancient Chinese and Japanese civilizations rejected cremation, though it was later 8th century on in Japan, adopted with the spread of Buddhism. Islam rejects cremation. The few instances of cremation in the Old Testament are not presented as in any way typical. They are instead unusual and exceptional. Every such historical account, legal prescription, or prophetic proclamation is associated with or occasioned by war or judgment for sin. The biblical text suggests that cremation was viewed as abhorrent or at least offensive. The connotations of fire imagery in Scripture are consistent with this rejection. Okay, so as he's summarizing that, and his summary goes on a little bit, but for sake of time, just to talk about what he's saying there, is that what you're looking at in Scripture when you look at the burning, fire is typically depicted as judgment, and when you're looking at the actual occurrences of burning bodies, they are those could never be pictured as usual examples. Okay. And then when you contrast that with the cultures, like he was saying, it is kind of interesting that you have some stark contrast, especially with the Roman world, and you have the Greeks before them practicing cremation regularly. Yet the Christians are resistant to that. The Jews are resistant to that. Even Islam, which obviously is not the true religion or anything, but it is a variation. It's kind of a perversion, if you will, of the biblical Old Testament. They claim that, at least. There is a holding to or the rejection of cremation with regard to their burial practices, and so it is fascinating looking at those comparison contrasts with the culture. Now, another thing that we need to think about is just theological underpinnings of this. And Decker has a section on this in his article as well. And I just want to talk a little bit about, theologically why this is a big deal. So for Christians, and some Christians have struggled with this historically. This is one of the debates about the eschatological worldview as well, because one of the things that makes premillennialism such an appealing view for people, or at least it was in the past in the early church, was because it was in contrast to the Greek view of the spiritual being good and the physical being bad. And, you had even other Christians making fun of premillennialists, talking about how they paid too much attention to this idea of an earthly kingdom, things like that. And so premillennialists argued adamantly that it's not just the spiritual that is good, but also the physical. God created a physical world, right? And it's similar with this issue where we acknowledge that God made human beings not just as spirits. It's not as if we're just waiting to be released from our body, but we acknowledge that our bodies are a part of God's good creation. It's a physicality, but it's not an inferior part of the creation. Physical isn't just weighing us down. The physicality is a part of God's good creation. And so theologically, Christians have understood that, and that's why I didn't have time to include some of these quotes, but there are quotes that you can read from Tertullian and other early church fathers which talk about the need to respect the body in burial and the need to prioritize and how that links with the future hope of Christians to have resurrection, because it's not just that sometimes some of the full preterists will throw around this idea that resurrection can't or doesn't include the physical body or something like that that's just made up. And you think about those kinds of things and you say, no, like throughout Scripture as well as early church belief, resurrection was tied to this idea that our bodies are being respected, laid in the ground, and the expectation is that we will reunite. Okay. Now, right away, somebody is probably going to say, well, then what about people who are lost at sea, who die, their body is decomposed over the vast, existence of the ocean or whatever? Listen, that's not the issue. In fact, God's not limited by those things, just like God's not limited if somebody's body is burned. He's not saying, well, shoot, now I'm stuck. That guy's not going to have a new body. I'll have to create something from scratch or whatever. God doesn't. That's not what God's not limited that way, right? He formed Adam really from dirt, is what Scripture says, and so he's capable of doing that, with people's bodily particles that have been floating around for thousands of years. God can do that. But the reality is there's a theological picture and symbolism here. And it's similar to baptism in some degree. I love the symbolism that's found in baptism, is that you have a picture in baptism. Now, baptism is mandated and commanded, so the analogy is not perfect and it is a little different. But in baptism, you are immersed into Christ. You're pictured as dying with him through the picture of baptism, and then you are raised from the water, and that is the Romans 6 picture of being united to his life, and therefore you live again, not by yourself this time. You're united to Christ, and so you live in newness. You walk in newness of life. And so I think that's similar to what's going on with burial, is that Christians historically have buried a body, not because they think that this body's going to stay here forever, nothing's going to change it, it's going to be perfect by the time the resurrection shows around. No, but it's a symbol, it's a picture of our belief and reverence that there is going to be a resurrection, and the body is a part of God's good creation. And so I think that when you look at those theological realities, it helps us understand how we ought to process these things. And again, I don't think it's actually possible to be definitive and say that there must be, in no case could you ever embrace cremation or anything like that. I don't think that's how you could go. In fact, I remember talking to somebody who had spent a great deal in Japan, and in Japan, it's actually mandated that you are cremated. And so would it be the Christian mindset to say, we're going to stand up for this and we must bury our dead no matter what? Would that be, no, I don't think that that's necessary. I don't think that it would be evil or wrong or sinful in that instance to go through with cremation or anything like that. But I do think that there ought to be an awareness of Christians to really embrace this idea that God created the physicality of creation, and we want to recognize that. Okay, so let me give you Decker's conclusion on this as he walks through. And again, the article is pretty long. It's 45 pages total, but here's his conclusion. All right. So Decker says, although my conclusion has been implied more or less directly at a number of points above, increasingly so in the last section, it remains to be asked more directly, is cremation a Christian option? And so he says, before addressing such a blunt question, we should begin with some broader queries. So this is really helpful. I always like to point out to Bible students that if Scripture does not, it's easy if Scripture specifically says to do something or not to do something. That's easy. But if Scripture doesn't, then you have to ask some other questions too. So these are the other questions he talks about. So first, does the Bible ever command, encourage, or condone cremation as an acceptable practice for disposing a believer's corpse? And so he says the obvious answer is no. That would have been made it a lot easier if you saw that. But what we can observe is that in the cases where it is practiced by God's command, so Leviticus, he's talking about there, 20 or 21, it's always the result of sin. Think of Achan or even something like Nadab and Abihu. So it's always the result of sin and is intentionally used to dramatize the extent of the rebellion involved and the severity of God's judgment. So again, where we do see cremation being used, it's linked with God's judgment and the severity of that. And then, so another question he asks, second, is cremation ever allowed in the Bible? And so he says, though we might dispute exactly what is meant by allowed, the biblical data does suggest that in exceptional situations, the practice is not condemned. That is not exactly a positive endorsement of the practice. In the case of King Saul and his sons, as well as the prophetic picture in Amos 6, cremation is referenced, but in the context of war. In both instances, the war was the result of disobedience by Saul on the one hand, by Israel as a whole on the other. These are not appropriate instances on which to build a defense of cremation as a normal or normative practice. They may be adequate to allow it in unusual circumstances, though it is scanty at best. So again, he's saying in the examples that we do see it allowed, it doesn't seem to be normative, it does seem to be exceptional. And so he does say here in the next paragraph here, following, I skipped one, but he says, third, must our funeral practices be dictated by the cultural practices of Bible times? So I think this is a good question, because I went through the funeral practices in the second temple as well as in the first temple. So there is a difference there in what they would do, how they would collect the bones in a bone box versus putting them in a bone pit where you'd have generations stacked on one another, which that would be my preference. I think it'd be cool to, have the bones of my life and my grandfather and my grandson all just kind of mashed together. That'd be kind of cool. But so that was one of the biblical practices of the first temple period. But the second temple period, you put it all in a bone box. And so his point here, which I'll just summarize, is that just because the Bible does describe something doesn't necessarily mean that that's what we should do. And I think that that's legitimate. I think it should help us understand, and the same thing could be true of marriage. Just because there was a process for being betrothed and then getting married doesn't mean that we would have to follow the exact same paradigm for that as well. So there is some flexibility there. Now, he says, is it irrelevant that when Christianity spread across the Western world, cremation ceased to be the most prevalent practice? Though burial was indeed a Jewish practice, the early church was soon a Gentile majority as the gospel spread across the Roman world. In Gentile areas, the norm was often cremation due to the many centuries of Greco-Roman influence. Yet, Christianity, even Gentile Christianity, never adopted or practiced cremation. This would suggest that the Christian worldview, including the Christian doctrines of creation and resurrection, inherently rejected a pagan practice viewed as incompatible with Christianity. And then he asks another question here. Fourth, what practice best reflects the Christian hope of the gospel? And that's kind of what I had talked about theologically, is that the burial practice is much more significant symbolically than cremation, obviously. Now, I will say too, that going back to what he had talked about with the majority, when Christianity marches across the globe, you have cremation ceasing to be very prevalent. And it is kind of interesting how now that Christianity is losing sway in many ways, cremation is really coming to rise in many of these formerly Christian cultures. That aside, I think that, what Decker is pointing at here is the difficulty of the issue is that there's no chapter and verse saying what you have to do. But he does point to the fact that 1 Corinthians 15, does talk very significantly about the expectation of resurrection. The picture is that of a seed which germinates, and then it comes to life with a new body. And I think Christians have intentionally been siding with that kind of analogy. And he goes through a couple other things with some by summary, but just to put it to the point now, he finally asks, so is cremation a Christian option? Is it a wise or legitimate decision for Christians in regards to their own funeral preferences or those of their loved ones? Now, he says, I would not go so far as to declare flatly that cremation is a sin. In some cases, it may be acceptable without embarrassment, but it would appear that the wisest decision, most compatible with Christian theology, and most effective in terms of Christian witness is, at least in the West, inhumation, which inhumation is the fancy pants term for burial. Okay, so to kind of bring it to a close here, I love the way Decker has thought about this, and I love how he's been very tentative in his conclusion as well, in the sense that I don't think we can browbeat one another over this issue. I think that Decker was very wise in how he approached this, saying that I don't think we can go so far as to say sin. I have many friends, family members who have participated in cremation. I'm sure you have as well. And it's one of those things where it's becoming more and more popular, right? And so I would never say, because we lack biblical warrant for this, I would never say that it's necessary or mandated to bury. And if you cremate a loved one or you yourselves are cremated, you are in sin. But I do think there is a biblical pattern here that we would be wise to follow, if at all possible, if we can follow that. And the analogy that I would make, some people are going to hate this analogy. Some of you are going to be like, oh, that's a good one. So whatever, I'm going to divide the masses right here. The analogy that I would make here is worshiping God on Sunday. And you might say, what? That's mandated. It's actually not. Nowhere in Scripture is there a mandate to worship God on Sunday. We are told, in fact, the Sabbath, Saturday, was the primary day of worship for the Old Testament saints. Under the law, the Israelites worshiped on the Sabbath, and that was a big part of their existence. Now, the Christians historically have worshiped on Sunday, which is not the Sabbath. Now, we'll have to do an episode at some point talking about the Sabbath, because there's a lot of fun things to talk about with regard to that, but the Sunday is not Sabbath. It can't be, because the Sabbath is very clearly delineated in the Old Testament. So the principle, though, is what some people would talk about. They would say, well, the principle applies. Well, that may be true, but nowhere does it actually say that principle is transferred to Sunday. There is a description in the New Testament of believers gathering the first day of the week. The early church regularly practiced that, and I think that is because Jesus rose on the first day of the week, and that's a part of the process and the historical pedigree of the church's existence, being bound to Christ. And so I think that makes a lot of sense to gather on the first day of the week in celebration of that. But is somebody, in a Muslim country in sin if they don't gather on the first day of the week, if they gather on a Friday or a Saturday or something like that? I don't think so. I think that there's flexibility there. And I think Paul's direct instructions in Romans 14 talk about that, how listen, some people treat one day as different, as special, and other people treat all day alike. And each one can do that, being convinced before the Lord. And so I think that there's direct scripture application, which would say this isn't a sin issue, what day you meet, but it's important that you realize it's not always just about whether something is sin or not. It's also about being wise and being intentional about how you live your life to communicate your theology with how you live. And so I think that illustrates what we're getting at here, is that as a Christian, I want everything that I do, from the very first breath I take, Lord willing, although I don't really have much of a choice when I'm a baby, but even through my death, I want everything about my life and death to be pointing to the reality of the fact that, I am bought for and paid for by Christ, that I expect to be with him after death, and that I'm looking forward to that final resurrection when he unites my body with my soul, and I'm eagerly looking forward to that renewal and restoration of creation. I think that's just such a great picture of the Christian hope and Christian faith. And so it really is more of an issue of wisdom rather than it is moral sin or not sin, I think. But I think it's important to think through these kinds of things and have detailed discussions on them. So hopefully this is somewhat helpful in kind of spurring that discussion on. I will put a link to this article in the description so you can investigate it further, and I'm sure I'll be able to have some good conversations and interactions with some of your comments on YouTube or through the contact form on my website. I always love engaging with those as I have time. And as always, it's just a pleasure to be talking about these things with you. If you want more information about Shepherd's Theological Seminary, where I teach, you can visit shepherds.edu. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you.